There exists a particular cruelty in how some people remain forever etched in memory, while others fade the moment they leave the room. Jung discovered this wasn't about beauty, success, or even kindness. It was about something far more primal, something he called psychological magnetism. And if you recognize even 3 of these 5 laws in yourself, you possess a rare power that makes others unable to forget you, even when they desperately want to. What makes someone unforgettable? Why do certain individuals haunt our thoughts, invade our dreams, and occupy spaces in our mind long after they've disappeared from our lives? The answer, according to Jung's decades of clinical observation, lies not in what these people do, but in what they are. They possess a constellation of psychological traits so rare that encountering them creates a wound in the psyche of others, a wound that never fully heals. But before we explore these 5 laws that make certain souls magnetically unforgettable, I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who completely disrupted your inner world? Someone whose presence felt like meeting a part of yourself you didn't know existed? Drop a comment and tell me which type of magnetic person you've encountered. The mysterious one who never fully revealed themselves, the intense one who saw through your masks, or the rare one who made you feel truly understood for the first time. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what Jung discovered about psychological magnetism will forever change how you understand attraction, obsession, and the invisible forces that bind human souls together. Share this with someone who's ever haunted your thoughts. They need to understand the power they carry. Jung's first law emerged from his observation of what he called differentiated individuals. These were patients who walked into his practice, not because they were broken, but because they had become too conscious for the unconscious world around them. And this consciousness, Jung discovered, created a magnetic field that others couldn't resist, even when it disturbed them. The first law is this: depth creates hunger in a shallow world. When you possess psychological depth, when you've done the inner work that most people avoid their entire lives, when you've integrated your shadow and faced your demons, you become something rare. And what is rare commands attention, desire, and obsession without effort. Here's what Jung observed in his clinical practice. When a deeply conscious person entered a room, something shifted in the atmosphere. People who had never done inner work, who lived entirely on the surface of life, felt simultaneously attracted and threatened. It was as if they sensed something in this person that they lacked in themselves, a depth of being that made their own existence feel hollow by comparison. Think about the people who've haunted your memory. Were they the ones who told you everything immediately, who revealed their entire selves within the first conversation? Or were they the ones who seemed to contain entire worlds within them, layers upon layers, that you could spend years exploring and never fully understand? Jung found that psychological depth operates like gravity. The deeper the well, the stronger the pull. But here's where this becomes both fascinating and dangerous. Depth cannot be faked. You cannot pretend to have done inner work when you haven't. You cannot manufacture the gravity that comes from genuine psychological integration. This is why so many people fail when they try to become mysterious or interesting. They're creating a performance rather than developing substance, and others sense this inauthenticity immediately. The truly magnetic person doesn't try to appear deep. They are deep. They've spent time in their own psychological underworld. They've confronted their shadow, integrated their pain, and emerged with a quality of presence that others find both mesmerizing and unsettling. When such a person speaks, even simple words carry weight, because they emerge from genuine psychological substance, rather than social performance. Jung documented cases where patients became obsessed with individuals who possessed this depth. One woman spent years unable to move past a brief relationship with a man who had this quality. It wasn't that he was physically attractive or socially successful. It was that speaking with him for even an hour felt like touching something eternal, something that made her own existence feel more real. After him, other men felt like cardboard cutouts, and this comparison haunted her for years. This is the first law's power and its danger. When you develop genuine psychological depth, you create a standard against which others are measured and found wanting. People who encounter you may find themselves unable to settle for surface-level connections afterward because you've shown them what depth feels like. And this awareness, once awakened, cannot be undone. But depth alone is not enough. Jung discovered that magnetic individuals possessed a second quality, one that transformed their depth from mere substance into actual power. This brings us to the second law, the principle of sacred scarcity. The second law states this: true rarity is not performed. It is embodied, and what cannot be replicated cannot be forgotten. Jung observed that magnetically unforgettable people shared a particular quality. They were not trying to be different or unique. They simply were. Their rarity emerged not from strategic withdrawal or calculated mystery, but from the fact that their psychological development had made them genuinely uncommon. Here's what Jung found most fascinating. When someone develops their individual consciousness fully, when they complete what he called the individuation process, they become statistically rare, not 1 in 100, not 1 in 1,000. Jung estimated that perhaps 1 in 10,000 people truly individuates, truly becomes who they were meant to be, rather than what society conditioned them to become. This rarity is not created through manipulation or performance. It is the natural result of psychological work that most people never undertake. And here's where Jung's insight becomes almost cruel in its accuracy. Rarity commands value automatically. You don't need to make yourself scarce through games or manipulation when you've genuinely become rare through psychological development. Your very presence carries weight because consciousness recognizes consciousness, and unconscious people sense something in you they cannot fully grasp, but desperately want to understand. Think about how people respond to genuine rarity. When someone encounters a truly individuated person, someone who has done the work of becoming psychologically whole, the experience is unforgettable precisely because it's so unusual. Most people go through life meeting variations of the same unconscious patterns, the same unexamined personas, the same psychological types repeating endlessly. But when they encounter someone who has broken free from collective conditioning, someone who operates from genuine self-knowledge rather than social programming, the contrast is shocking. Jung documented this phenomenon repeatedly in his practice. Patients would describe encounters with individuals who seemed to operate by different rules, who appeared unaffected by the social pressures that controlled everyone else, who spoke from some inner authority that made conventional social hierarchies irrelevant. And these encounters left lasting impressions, sometimes haunting people for decades. But here's the crucial distinction Jung made. This scarcity must be real, not performed. You cannot fake individuation. You cannot pretend to be psychologically whole when you're still fragmented. You cannot manufacture the presence that comes from genuine self-knowledge. When people try to create artificial scarcity through manipulation, through calculated withdrawal or strategic unavailability, others sense the performance. It may work temporarily, but it lacks the substance that creates lasting magnetism. The truly scarce individual doesn't need to withdraw strategically because their natural rhythm already includes solitude. They don't need to create mystery because their psychological complexity is genuinely mysterious, even to themselves. They don't need to play hard to get because they're genuinely engaged in pursuits that matter more to them than social validation. This authenticity is what creates real magnetic power, and notice this carefully. When you encounter someone with this quality of genuine rarity, your response is different from meeting someone who's merely playing games. With game players, you feel manipulated, even if you can't articulate why. With genuinely rare individuals, you feel something closer to awe. You sense you're in the presence of someone who has achieved something most people never will, actual psychological freedom. And this recognition creates not just attraction, but something deeper, a hunger to understand how they achieved what you haven't. Jung observed that this hunger could become consuming. People would restructure their lives trying to maintain connection with these rare individuals, not because they were being manipulated, but because proximity to genuine consciousness awakened something in them they didn't want to lose. It was as if being near someone who had truly individuated reminded them of possibilities they had abandoned in themselves. But rarity and depth, while powerful, are not the complete picture. Jung discovered a third quality that transformed psychological magnetism from mere attraction into something closer to obsession. This quality was perhaps the most disturbing of all his findings, and it leads us to the third law. The third law is this: your integrated shadow attracts others' unintegrated darkness. When you've done shadow work, when you've faced and integrated your own darkness, you become a magnet for people who are terrified of their own shadow. And this attraction operates at an unconscious level that neither party fully understands. Here's what Jung observed that disturbed him most. People who had successfully integrated their shadow, who had acknowledged and accepted their capacity for darkness, cruelty, selfishness, and destruction, developed a particular kind of presence. They carried their darkness consciously rather than projecting it outward, and unconscious people could sense this darkness, but because it was integrated and owned, it felt strangely safe. Jung documented cases where individuals with integrated shadows found themselves surrounded by people who were unconsciously drawn to them, specifically because they hadn't done their own shadow work. It was as if the unconscious darkness in these people recognized something in the individuated person, a model of what darkness looks like when it's been faced rather than repressed. Think about the most magnetically attractive people you've encountered. Were they purely light and positive, or did they carry something darker, something that suggested they understood the full spectrum of human experience, including its ugliest aspects? Jung found that people who had only developed their persona, their social mask, were pleasant but forgettable, but people who had integrated their shadow possessed a depth and complexity that was impossible to ignore. This creates a strange dynamic. When you integrate your shadow, you become capable of understanding darkness in others without judgment, because you've acknowledged the same darkness in yourself. This non-judgmental understanding is intoxicating to people who are drowning in shame about their own hidden impulses. They sense that you won't condemn them, that you've seen darkness and survived it, and this makes you safe in a way that purely good people never are. But here's the dangerous part Jung warned about. This attraction isn't always healthy. Sometimes people are drawn to your integrated shadow because they want you to carry their darkness for them. They want to experience vicariously through you the parts of themselves they're too afraid to acknowledge. This can create a dynamic where others become obsessed with you not because they want to integrate their own shadow, but because being near you allows them to avoid doing their own inner work. Jung saw this repeatedly in his practice. A patient would become fixated on someone with an integrated shadow, fascinated by their psychological wholeness, but unwilling to undertake the terrifying journey of facing their own darkness. They wanted to absorb the other person's consciousness rather than develop their own, and this created a kind of psychological vampirism that could last years or even decades. The truly magnetic person with an integrated shadow walks a delicate line. On one hand, their wholeness attracts others powerfully. On the other hand, this attraction often comes from people who want to possess their consciousness rather than develop their own, and navigating this dynamic requires tremendous psychological sophistication. Jung found that people with integrated shadows often reported feeling both deeply attractive and profoundly lonely. They attracted intense interest, but much of that interest came from people who wanted to consume their psychological wholeness rather than recognize them as complete individuals. It was as if their integration made them objects of fascination rather than subjects of genuine relationship. But there's another dimension to this law that Jung found equally important. When you integrate your shadow, you become capable of seeing others with remarkable clarity. You can perceive the shadow material that others are repressing because you've learned to recognize it in yourself. This perception creates a particular kind of interaction where the other person feels simultaneously seen and exposed in a way that's both thrilling and terrifying. Have you ever met someone who seemed to see through all your defenses, who recognized aspects of you that you barely admitted to yourself? That's the power of an integrated shadow. It gives you X-ray vision into others' psychological structures, and this ability to truly see people is one of the most magnetic qualities anyone can possess, because being truly seen is one of the deepest human hungers. But this seeing comes with responsibility. When you can perceive others' shadows clearly, you hold tremendous power over them. You know their secrets, their fears, their repressed desires, even if they never speak them aloud. And how you handle this knowledge determines whether you use your magnetism ethically or destructively. Jung was clear about this. The integrated shadow gives you power, but power without ethics creates monsters. The truly magnetic person uses their shadow integration to help others face their own darkness, rather than exploiting that darkness for personal gain. This ethical dimension is what separates psychological magnetism from psychological manipulation. And this brings us naturally to the fourth law, perhaps the most practical and immediately applicable of Jung's discoveries about unforgettable souls. This law deals with how magnetic people affect others, not just through who they are, but through what they do to others' psychological states. The fourth law states this: you transform everyone you touch. When someone encounters genuine consciousness, they cannot return to unconsciousness unchanged. Meeting you becomes a psychological event that reorganizes their inner world, and this transformation binds them to the memory of you permanently. Jung observed something remarkable in his practice. When patients encountered someone who possessed genuine psychological development, the encounter itself became a catalyst for change. It was as if consciousness was contagious, but in a way that was often uncomfortable for the infected. After meeting such a person, patients found they could no longer tolerate the same relationships, the same work, the same patterns that had satisfied them before. This is different from mere inspiration or motivation. This is psychological alchemy. When you interact with someone from a place of genuine integration and consciousness, you literally change the structure of their psyche. You awaken possibilities in them they didn't know existed. You make them aware of dimensions of experience they had been blind to. And once awakened, these new dimensions cannot be ignored. Think about the people who changed your life, not through what they taught you, but simply through who they were. Perhaps a conversation of only an hour left you questioning everything about how you lived. Perhaps a brief relationship showed you possibilities you'd never imagined before. This is the transformative power of genuine consciousness. It reorganizes the psychological landscape of everyone it touches. Jung documented this phenomenon repeatedly. A woman would meet a man who possessed this quality for a single evening, and that evening would echo through her psyche for years. Not because he did anything particularly special, but because his level of consciousness showed her that a completely different way of being was possible. And once she'd glimpsed this possibility, she could never fully settle back into her previous unconsciousness. But here's what makes this law particularly powerful in terms of magnetism. When you transform someone, when you catalyze genuine psychological change in them, they don't forget you. They can't. You've become part of their developmental process, a marker of before and after in their psychological history. Before you, they were one kind of person. After you, they became something different, and that difference carries your fingerprint permanently. This creates a particular kind of bond that transcends normal attraction or attachment. It's not that they necessarily want to be with you or even like you. It's that you've become an integral part of their psychological structure, a reference point against which they measure their own growth. And this integration into their psyche makes you unforgettable in a way that mere affection or desire never could. Jung observed that people who possessed this transformative quality often had no idea of the impact they were having. They weren't trying to change others, they were simply being fully themselves, operating from integrated consciousness, and that consciousness acted like a catalyst wherever it went. Other people's psychological material would begin to reorganize itself in response to this presence, often in ways that were initially uncomfortable or destabilizing. And here's where this becomes almost dangerous. When you transform someone, when you catalyze real change in their psyche, you create a kind of psychological dependency that has nothing to do with weakness or need. They return to you, they think about you, they can't let you go, not because they're obsessed in a pathological sense, but because you represent a developmental threshold in their life. You're the doorway through which they passed into a new level of consciousness, and doorways become sacred. But transformation is not always welcome. Jung found that many people resented those who had catalyzed change in them, even positive change, because the transformation forced them to abandon comfortable patterns and face uncomfortable truths. This resentment coexisted with fascination, creating a complex emotional mix of attraction, anger, gratitude, and fear. The truly magnetic person accepts this complexity. They understand that transforming others comes with the territory of being conscious, and they don't take the resulting emotions personally. They recognize that their impact on others is not really about them as individuals, but about what they represent, the possibility of consciousness in an unconscious world. And this leads us naturally to the fifth and final law, the one Jung considered most important and most misunderstood. This law deals with the lasting impact of magnetic individuals, why some people never fade from memory, even after decades of separation. The fifth law is this: you create unforgettable wounds. When someone encounters genuine consciousness, especially if they're unprepared for it, the encounter wounds them psychologically, not in a pathological sense, but in the sense that it opens something in them that cannot be closed again. And that wound keeps you alive in their memory forever, not as a person they once knew, but as an experience they can never fully integrate or forget. Jung's concept of the psychological wound was central to his understanding of transformation and magnetism. He observed that the most significant encounters in human life were those that wounded the psyche in this particular way, that created an opening through which new consciousness could enter, but which could never fully heal, because the consciousness that entered was too vast to be contained. Think about the concept of a wound. It's a breaking of boundaries, an intrusion into protected space. When someone with genuine consciousness enters your psychological space, they break through defenses you didn't even know you had. They see parts of you that were hidden. They awaken aspects of yourself that were dormant. They show you possibilities that disrupt your entire understanding of who you are and what life can be. This breaking through, this wounding, is why they become unforgettable. It's not about pleasant memories or happy times, though those may exist. It's about the fact that they fundamentally altered your psychological structure, and that alteration remains as a permanent mark, a scar that reminds you that once, briefly, you touched something more real than your everyday existence. Jung observed that people could spend decades unable to move past certain encounters, not because they were clinging to the past, but because the wound created by the encounter never fully healed. And this wound kept the other person alive in their psyche as a presence, a voice, a standard, a possibility that haunted them. Here's what makes this law particularly powerful. You don't create these wounds through manipulation or strategy. You create them simply by being conscious enough that your presence breaks through others' psychological defenses. When you operate from genuine integration, from real self-knowledge, from actual psychological development, you automatically wound everyone who's still living in unconscious patterns, because your presence reveals to them, often without words, how much of life they're missing. This is why magnetic people are simultaneously desired and feared. They offer the possibility of transformation, but transformation requires death, the death of old patterns, old identities, old ways of being. And most people crave transformation while simultaneously resisting it with everything they have. Jung found that the most powerful magnetic individuals were those who had been deeply wounded themselves and had transformed those wounds into consciousness. Their own suffering had made them capable of touching others' suffering with precision and depth. They knew where the psychological wounds were because they had mapped their own. And this knowledge gave them the power to wound others therapeutically, to break through defenses in ways that served growth rather than destruction. But here's the ethical dimension. Jung emphasized, creating psychological wounds is a tremendous responsibility. You can wound others in ways that destroy them, or you can wound them in ways that awaken them. The difference lies in your intention and your level of consciousness. If you wound others to prove your power, to feed your ego, to control or manipulate, you're using magnetism destructively. But if you wound others simply by being conscious, by living authentically, by refusing to collude with unconsciousness, then the wounds you create serve a transformative purpose. And so we arrive at the complete picture of what Jung discovered about psychological magnetism. It's not about manipulation tactics or strategic behavior. It's not about making yourself artificially scarce or playing games with others' emotions. It's about genuine psychological development that creates natural magnetism as a byproduct. The 5 laws work together. Your depth creates hunger in others. Your genuine rarity makes you valuable without effort. Your integrated shadow allows you to see and be seen at profound levels. Your consciousness transforms everyone you touch, and the psychological wounds you create keep you alive in others' memories permanently. This is why certain people are unforgettable, not because they're trying to be, but because they've become so conscious, so integrated, so genuinely rare that encountering them is a psychological event rather than just a social interaction. And psychological events, unlike social pleasantries, are never forgotten. But remember this: psychological magnetism comes with tremendous responsibility. When you possess these qualities, when you develop this level of consciousness, you affect others whether you intend to or not. People will become attached to you, obsessed with you, haunted by you, not because you're manipulating them, but because you represent something their psyche desperately hungers for. Jung warned that this power could be used destructively. He saw many cases where individuals with genuine magnetism exploited it for personal gain, feeding their egos on others' fascination, using their transformative impact to control rather than liberate. And he was clear that this represented a profound failure of ethical development, a situation where someone had developed psychological sophistication without developing moral wisdom. The truly magnetic person, according to Jung, uses their impact on others to serve growth, both their own and others. They don't try to keep people attached or dependent. They don't exploit the psychological wounds they create. They accept that their presence will transform others, and they take responsibility for that impact without trying to control its outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, they continue their own development. Magnetism is not a destination, but a process. The moment you stop growing, the moment you think you've arrived at complete consciousness, you begin to lose the very qualities that made you magnetic. True magnetism requires ongoing transformation, continuous shadow work, perpetual deepening. So the question you must ask yourself is not how can I make others obsessed with me, but am I willing to undertake the psychological work that naturally creates magnetism as a byproduct? Are you willing to face your shadow, to integrate your darkness, to develop genuine depth? Are you willing to individuate, to become rare, not through performance, but through actual psychological development? Are you willing to take responsibility for the impact your consciousness has on others? If you are, if you commit to genuine psychological work rather than manipulative tactics, then magnetism will develop naturally. You won't need strategies or games. Your simple presence will wound others therapeutically, transform them catalytically, and remain with them permanently. Not because you're trying to be unforgettable, but because you've become conscious enough that encountering you is an event others' psyches cannot ignore. Jung spent his life studying those rare individuals who possessed this quality, and his conclusion was always the same. Magnetism is not a trick or a technique. It's the natural radiation of integrated consciousness. Develop the consciousness, and the magnetism follows inevitably. Now the choice is yours. You can remain ordinary, living on the surface of life, meeting others at the level of persona and social performance, or you can descend into your own depths, face your shadow, integrate your wounds, and emerge as someone who transforms everyone they touch, simply by being fully themselves. In a world where most people hide behind masks, be the one who dares to be real. In a world where most people avoid their darkness, be the one who integrates it. In a world where most people chase attention, be the one who commands it through consciousness alone. For those who undertake this work, who commit to genuine psychological development, magnetism is not something they create, it's something they become. Then once you become it, you cannot be forgotten, because you don't just enter others' lives, you enter their psyches, permanently altering the landscape of their consciousness. Write in the comments which of Jung's 5 laws resonates most powerfully with you. Are you someone who creates depth in a shallow world? Have you integrated your shadow? Do you transform everyone you touch? Your recognition of these patterns is the first step toward understanding the power you already carry, and the responsibility that comes with it. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological power, consciousness, and the invisible forces that bind human souls. And share this with someone who's ever haunted your thoughts, because they need to understand the laws they're operating under, whether they know it or not. The magnetically unforgettable don't try to be remembered. They simply become so conscious that forgetting them is impossible.